It's great to be here in Berlin. I came in with my wife a couple days ago. We've had an opportunity to get our feet on the ground, and the energy here is terrific, and the energy at this conference that Tech Open Air has put together has been awesome too. So it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm co-founder of a company called TruSTAR. It's a cybersecurity company, and I'm not going to dwell down on the details of technologies and stuff like that today. But although I'm in the cybersecurity business, I'm here to argue that essentially our approach to cybersecurity is broken. Or perhaps better said, it's never really worked. And if we look at the economics of what's happened out there today in cybersecurity, by 2020, we're supposed to be spending around the order of $170 billion a year to secure ourselves. But yet we have a preponderance of attacks taking place. Financial Times this weekend talked about a cyber arms race underway. Naturally, in the States, we're rather focused on cybersecurity right now for obvious reasons, given the thinking that Russia was somehow trying to influence our elections in the United States, and some of the same thinking is going on here in Europe. Spending lots of money, short of the people, the people to actually help try to keep those networks secure, but yet we have adversaries that continue to have great success, where the amount of time it takes them to attack us is going down significantly. The amount of dollars it's taking them in order to conduct attacks is going down significantly. They're putting computers to work for themselves. There was a presentation earlier today on the use of AI. AI is okay with me, but let's not assume that we're the only ones using AI as the good guys. Adversaries will use the same technologies against us. So I would argue it's broken, and why? Here's my thinking. Our posture, our mindset is incorrect. It doesn't make sense. We are fighting the adversaries individually, company by company, organization by organization, government by government. Yeah, we might have a little bit of collaboration, but the most important data in cybersecurity today is sitting inside the four walls of the companies and organizations that are hacked. I would argue it's time to improve collaboration and to begin to exchange incident data among, so to speak, the good guys. That's why I'm here today, to break down the walls. And it's, if you will, apt to be here in Berlin to argue for the beginning of a movement to begin to break down the walls and to begin to look at cybersecurity differently than we have before. To think how we can approach cybersecurity from a more collaborative mindset. So, better said, how did I reach this conclusion? And let me go back in time a little bit on my career. I spent about 20 years in the federal government in the United States. And I worked on weapons of mass destruction, non-proliferation, trying to keep weapons out of the hands of the bad guys in North Korea and Iraq, and you can tell I was a raging success in that area. We still have significant problems there, but I learned a lot about intelligence analysis and how you try to free up and analyze and break open data. And then I went down to the White House, and I was director of counterterrorism on the White House, and was sitting in the Situation Room on the day of 9/11, when, of course, the planes hit the World Trade Centers. And it was an eye-opening experience for me. Now, I know for many here, you weren't necessarily around or you weren't really cognizant of the news at that time, but it was an eye-opening experience for me because I was director of counterterrorism before, and my job at the White House was to get agencies like CIA, FBI, and NSA to begin to exchange data with each other about what they knew Al-Qaeda's plans might be, or Osama bin Laden's plans might be. When I would chair those conferences, I would often be told, hey, we can't share that data. It will expose sources and methods. It will cause legal complications. rice bowls, or bureaucratic infighting was a problem as well. It left us in the absence of the most important data. And on the team at the White House, we had a feeling, we had a suspicion that we weren't getting all the data we needed in order to bring it together in one place in order to affect change, in order to preempt or to deter or stop attacks. And we know what happened. That had a profound impact on me in my career. And to some sense today, I still feel responsible. Could I have done more? Could the government have done more to fuse data together, to break it out of the four walls wherever it might be? So immediately after 9/11, I started looking at cybersecurity. I felt that this would be a challenge for us going forward that was different than weapons of mass destruction, that was different than counterterrorism, and in fact, it would be something that would be very difficult to handle given the preponderance of technology in everyone's hands. And in the beginning, everybody thought it was a backwater place, but it's obviously changed to where it is today. So in the post-9/11 environment where we are, how does 9/11 actually compare to where we are in cybersecurity today? Well, it works a little, but not fully. In other words, the most important data is sitting inside companies today as they're attacked, but yet the adversaries are far different than we had in the context of 9/11. We have everybody using technology to launch attacks. By everybody, I mean hackers, I mean nation states, I mean criminal organizations. And what makes it even more challenging, it's often hard to discern the differences between all of those adversaries. So how do we begin to put a collaborative environment together to begin to change up how we approach cybersecurity? So if I look at when I was a kid, Mom and Dad would tell me, you know, when it would come to a thunderstorm, you know, you have the lightning, and if you count 1,001, 1,002, 1,003, you know, then you'd hear the thunder. Well, it kind of works for cybersecurity. When one company is attacked, you can bet that shortly thereafter, there will be other companies that are attacked as well. And so when I think about just simply getting our hands around the idea of collaboration, if one company has been attacked, you can bet there are going to be lots of other companies attacked as well. So if we think about the big picture and how we might begin a collaborative environment and working together, clearly we know how to communicate. We have satellites in space, we exchange data all the time, we have lots of really cool companies that are developing neat technologies to help us out. Many of them are listed here around the globe. But a lot of the technology is developed by people at this conference that ultimately might be purchased by a big firm. So the technology's there. A lot of the technology for us to communicate and work together and collaborate is present with us today. So when we think about how might we begin to open up the flow of data and begin to collaborate, we got to think about, well, how do we actually do intel? Well, if you look at just your particular point, your house, your company, your organization, you're missing the bigger picture. You might have cybersecurity in place, you might have the best and the brightest people, the best technology, but you can bet the adversaries are going to go through it and they're going to be attacking others. Well, you might want a broader perspective. You might want to work with, you know, a couple of friend companies you trust, but nonetheless, you're denying yourself of yet a broader perspective of what's really going on. You want to expand out your understanding to have a more comprehensive or synoptic view of what's going on around you. That's what you do in the intelligence world. You can't just rely on one or two sources and think that you have it all. It's a puzzle, and you have to often put it together. So if we back out and think about how we might establish order out of chaos, kind of a Newtonian feel of right now, cybersecurity feels very chaotic, out of control, the Wild West. But we can make some order of this chaos if in fact we start to exchange information with each other about the events that are going on today. And so if we go back down to, well, what might some collaborative models be that would help us think through the possibilities of success? Well, one is, let's start at NATO. 1948, the Berlin blockade right here in town. Stalin decided to blockade Berlin, not allow foodstuffs to come in over the road. And that brought his bet, Stalin's bet was that, you know, the West won't go to battle. They'll let Berlin go. It's not worth it. Well, that didn't happen. What happened was the West, so to speak, 12 countries, formed up NATO. And they stood together, and that ultimately deterred Stalin from moving forward. And thus, really, the Cold War took off. Interestingly enough, in one of the tours my wife and I did this week, when we were here, when you look at Gorbachev and why he ultimately stepped back, why he signaled in 1989 that it wasn't worth paying for the defense of the Eastern Bloc because it had become far too expensive for him. In other words, the alliance of NATO had become too much for the Soviet Union to handle. Think about that in terms of forming alliances in cyberspace among companies being able to work together and exchange data and driving up the cost for adversaries, whoever they may be. It works. Let's go to another example. The Human Genome Project, mapping the human genome. This effort started in 1989 and went on 12, 13 years. And between several countries and universities and US government, we mapped a human genome. That was about information sharing. We sped up the process, made it work far faster than anybody ever thought could happen. Let's fast forward again to present day and where we are with social networking. Social networking has brought us to the power of social networking is tremendous. If we look at, say, for example, Twitter. A study came out just a couple of months ago, or 3 months ago. Northeastern University in the United States. They looked at 50 million samples of data, tweets, and did searches on anything with regard to flu symptoms. You know, headache, nausea, fever, whatever it might be. And they could predict 6 weeks in advance that there was a flu epidemic coming. Today in cyberspace, it takes usually 45 days for a company to acknowledge they've been hacked. And think of all the damage that's done in between times. If you look at LinkedIn and their users, we have a much sturdier profile of professions across the world now because of the number of LinkedIn users that are keeping an active profile. We can tell more about employment trends and hiring trends by looking at that space. So when we back out to look at cyberspace more specifically, we see every sector of the economy being attacked. From finance to transportation to health to all the other utilities that are out there. And the adversaries are having great success with it. And we have some, if you will, sector-specific efforts underway to share data. But they're not necessarily working as well as you would hope because they are sector-specific. And the adversaries are using attacks to go after multiple sectors at the same time. And that leaves us with a situation of, well, how do I ultimately get my hands around this situation? And my argument, and this sounds naive, but we really do need to start to move to come together to collaborate. Because if we don't, it's going to still be chaos. It's going to drive up costs. Your personal data won't work, or it won't, your personal data won't be safe. And now, just in the past 6 to 7 months, we see utilities being attacked. We see potentially Ukraine being a test bed for attacks that might be used here in Europe, elsewhere around the world. It's not just your personal data at risk. It's the viability of the technology we use that gives us our everyday support, from going into the emergency room. And we've had the situation in the UK with WannaCry and people being turned away from emergency rooms a year and a half ago. We saw that at Hollywood Presbyterian in the United States. It's become a big deal. It's no longer about data breach. Fast forward a year or so, the good old days will be data breach. It's going to be about, are the systems actually working when they need to be working? So how do we put together a movement? Well, I think how do we bring order to the chaos? Well, I think there are three big pieces that I think most anybody would think about are part of a movement. Number one, it's got to be voluntary. And this is an important point. I want to dwell on two issues here. Number one, this is not going to be led by government. By that I mean it's also not going to be something that's pushed via government regulation. In other words, if governments regulate us into exchanging data, it will fail. You know why? Because it will be a litigious process. The lawyers will get involved and they'll say yes to some information, no to sharing other information, and ultimately the bad guys, the adversaries, will get in the middle of that and they'll ravish us all in between. It's got to be voluntary. There's got to be a give and get. There's got to be a way to work together. And that brings the second piece, pooled resources. We have to be able to have the mechanisms to work together. And that's in part what TruSTAR is about. It's about creating those voluntary mechanisms so you can begin to exchange data, you can begin to pool resources to work together, and ultimately seek the greater good. That's what I've spent my time on since I started TruSTAR a few years ago. The technology is pretty basic. It's basically a means of exchanging data that allows you to preserve to exchange data anonymously and without attribution. That helps a more free-flowing way of moving data around. So if I take an example, if we go out to outer space, and this is a bit of a push, but we'll just go ahead and do it anyway because it's a funky slide. And we'll look at a fellow sitting in the cockpit here in the space shuttle, but it could easily be a power plant, a financial institution, an emergency room, whatever it might be. And all of a sudden, we have a situation, you've been hacked. And you don't necessarily know why, don't know how, but why we don't have collaboration today is because, should I confess? Should I own up that I've been hacked? What about my reputation? If I fess up, what's going to happen to my market? Am I going to lose customers? Or am I going to incur a financial loss? All very legitimate questions. And what kind of return will I get if I'm hacked and I give up some information and share the information with others? Am I going to ultimately get something back? All of these stop the flow of information with context in a timely way. And so the trick is ultimately how we grab the data from inside those four walls of companies and begin to exchange that effectively. There are three pain points that companies have today. Number one, first of all, they may not even have a sense of their own events, their own problems. And so they have to rationalize that. They have to put that data together in some way. And the second problem is there's lots of talk about threat intel. Lots of that threat intel isn't necessarily useful. It's not necessarily germane, or it's not actionable. So you have to help companies with that. And then the third piece that has to fall in place is you have to be able to exchange the data and protect your market risk and get something in return. And so that's what we have done at TruSTAR. And what is interesting about where we are with TruSTAR is we now have Fortune 500 companies that have set up private exchanges. I've got 7 Fortune 500 companies in the Midwest. They range from Battelle and Huntington Bank and Cardinal Health and several others who are committed to work together. The Cloud Security Alliance has committed to come together to start to exchange data. Another one is the retail sector has come together and committed to exchange data across a platform like TruSTAR's. It's possible. So when we think of going ahead and putting together a big picture, it's platforms like TruSTAR that are going to take and aggregate the data, put it together in a recognizable format that's actionable so we can ultimately do a better job protecting ourselves. I'm not arguing that collaboration is a panacea. It takes care of everything. Obviously, you still have to put in place the security on your systems, but it is not sufficient. There is no way you can go it alone anymore. Companies have to begin to exchange data with other companies. And the three elements, ultimately, of coming together are working cross sectors, incentivizing that exchange, and showing that operational value every day. So with that, I'll close, and if there may be questions.
All right, your first question. What's your take on Snowden?
Traitor. Yeah. Let's think about this a little bit. I think that he was put in a position of trust, exposed a lot of important programs, let me finish the sentence, and exposed a lot of important programs that were put in place to protect us from terrorist activities, plain and simple. Having said that, did the government go too far? And did it, if you will, push too far? Yes, it did. Okay. And so, to think of the programs that have been put in place to try to protect people, and being a former counterterrorism guy, and understanding how nasty the bad guys can be, and you felt this in Berlin in December. Many companies or countries have felt it. We have to have the programs in place, but we have to respect privacy. We need those programs to protect privacy as well.
I can buy malware on the dark web for $100 without even needing to code. How many hackers behind the scenes are former security experts?
Yeah, that's a great question. Having the malware out there, easy to grab and exercise. Brian Krebs did this piece on Philadelphia, which is a ransomware platform, which you just pay $100 and you can launch ransomware attacks against a bunch of folks and a bunch of companies and basically reap the dividends. How many of the folks behind there might ultimately be security experts? Obviously, there are going to be security experts that have gotten involved. Chris Roberts is a good example. Chris Roberts, a respected security expert, did some really good work, but then ultimately on the aviation space went too far. Decided to get on a plane, decided he would try to hack the plane in flight. Not a great idea. But this goes back to the point I make. If the companies begin exchanging data and have an understanding of what's going on between each other, it's going to make every adversary's job more difficult. I'm not saying impossible, but at least more difficult.
Do you think that capitalism inherently jeopardizes the notion of exchanging data because of the constant competition between companies?
No. I actually, when you, the challenge for companies is when the front part of the question is okay, but the reality in the end, I don't think works. When you look at a company, what they're concerned about in giving up data about a hack is whether they will be exposed, whether it will be known that Yahoo or whatever entity it is has been exposed. If you give them the ability to trade data in real time and not have attribution, then the data begins to flow. But that's only half the problem. The other half of the problem is that the operators need to have value in the data that's ultimately shared, or the security operators. So if the security operators, if you're the boss and you say, Paul, I want you to share all this information with all these other companies, and I can't keep up with my job anyway, I'm gonna be like, yeah, I'll do it on Friday at the end of the day. But if I can trade data and get value back immediately, then they'll do it. And that's exactly what we've done at TruSTAR. We have companies that are trading data in real time because they get a return.
Shouldn't there be a worldwide organization to form and provide an impartial layer?
Not exactly sure what is meant by an impartial layer. But let me say a couple of things. There is, for the first time, there's going to be a conference, an international conference in Washington at the end of October, beginning of November in Washington, focused on information sharing, an international sharing organization. TruSTAR will be there, and we'll be talking about the alliances been put together in Columbus, Ohio. I want to reiterate, this is not a problem that is going to be solved by government. So we can have governments around a table, put together all sorts of arrangements and all sorts of agreement, and it's not going to work. And why? Because government can't move fast enough. There's a really interesting book by Joshua Cooper Ramo who talks about the internet murdering time. Government doesn't have the institutional capability to keep up. Private sector organizations, because they're getting hacked every day, can exchange that data with each other. Government might ultimately be a part of that, but this problem, I would argue, is going to be solved by the private sector.
The last one is, since both the attackers and the attacked come from similar fields, NGOs, government, private sector, how do you decide who to exchange data with?
Great question. What we have in the States that is unfolding, and actually we do have European customers as well, is companies simply come together and decide that they want to begin to exchange data. There are larger companies right now. We do have some smaller companies in place. We are starting to work. We actually just signed a deal with our first NGO last week. And it's going to be, let's put it this way, secure communities is probably the way to describe it, where communities will be erected. They'll begin to exchange data. They'll find out that there are other parties they want to bring into the secure community. And Ramo in his book talks about, ultimately we're going to have like CDC-like organizations, Center for Disease Control-like organizations in cyberspace. They're going to basically be the gated communities of, if you're not inside that community, the level of danger and costs and risk to you will be prohibitive. You won't be able to not be inside a community. And those communities will evolve around a level of trust. If you're not deemed as trustworthy, a part of a community, then you probably won't be inside of it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Paul. Please
Thank you,
give a
everybody.
warm applause to Paul.
Thank you.